So let's continue. So one of the things that's very important is the verb here to acclimate. And so to acclimate means that we have to become used to the sort of environment around us, right? Whenever you go to a new school, new university, or even a new job or a new home, you have to kind of acclimate yourself and get used to the environment around you. In this case, when you want to acclimate yourself to the environment around you, you also have to sort of assimilate, and that's a sociological word. You have to assimilate and fit yourself into this place, right? And this is something that a biologist is extremely good at. This is exactly what her specialty is and becomes very useful. One of the things that's very important is that she talks about what she might see near the base camp. For example, black bears, coyotes, and even huge aquatic reptiles, right? And so these things are sort of very uncanny in that you probably would not see uh, a black bear, a coyote, and an alligator. You usually see, for example, alligators and crocodiles are much more popular in Florida because that's where they are. Black bears can be seen in places that are more tropical, but typically speaking, when you think of bears, you think of them being in the snow or in the mountains. Same with coyotes, they're in a more desert area. So they're not going to necessarily be where the marshes are. So it's supposed to be a sort of juxtaposition here, right? And the reason why Vandermeer does this and shows a picture of this sort of little hog is because on page 15, I believe it is, in chapter 1, they actually encounter the sort of wild boar. That's what he calls the wild boar. And when they encounter it, they have to think about the uncanny example of what it is and why it's so uncanny. There's something about it that makes it extremely uncanny, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the next thing I wanted to talk about was more about the uncanny environment here, right? The huge uncanny environment is where he says there's eerie signs of human habitation. You may not have been to a place that's like this, but you can see that humans clearly had lived here at one time, but everything's been sort of controlled or taken over by nature, right? There's a sort of saying that if humans go, then nature's going to take over. And in this case, he uses a great term that you could definitely use for your essay, which he says desolation tries to colonize you. But again, when you're talking about a direct quote, you want to use the sort of larger context because he's not just talking about desolation and colonizing. He's also referring to this sort of low, powerful moaning at dusk, which is a motif, a recurring image that occurs in this novel, and is supposed to represent the uncanny, right? So if you're trying to explain how the uncanny exists in this novel, when you talk about the moaning at dusk, this is something that you could use, right? The biologist says all you could hear was the low moaning woo. Again, the effect of this cannot be understood without being there. So she's trying to give you this image, but you might not be able to feel that fear that she feels. The beauty of it cannot be understood either. And when you see beauty in desolation, it changes something inside of you. Why is that important? Beauty and desolation. So when things look terrible, downtrodden, it's something still beautiful about it, right? Because nature is taking over. And if you are into nature and this is your thing, you might find that beautiful and something unique and special. And it changes something inside you. What does it do? It transforms the way that you see the way that human life is, right? Sometimes we take for granted we see all these cars, we see all these people, all this technology. But what happens when you see nature conquer and take over it? It changes and transforms something inside you. Desolation tries to colonize you. That means it tries to control you and be master over you, right? And so this sort of thing would be something that you could requote. this can easily be 3 to 4 sentences of requoting. That way you can give yourself another 3 to 4 sentences to talk about the sort of main ideas and why they are important. Okay, so we're going to kind of move on from this, and we're going to kind of go straight into the very first time they are going to talk to one another. That is the four women talking to each other. And the first thing you need to think about is, again, the question I asked you: do you see it as a tower or as a tunnel? This is actually a question that you can use in psychology. If, for example, some people see it as a tunnel, other people see it as a tower, there might be a difference in how they are. So psychologists, for example, could use this as a sort of what we call litany test, right? They could say, well, what if people who are introverted see this as a tunnel and people who are extroverted see it as a tower, right? So it's very interesting what you can do with this. And so she says, I don't know why the word tower came to me, given that it tunneled underground. I could have easily have called it a bunker or submerged building. Yet as soon as I saw the staircase, I remembered the lighthouse and had a sudden vision of the last expedition drifting off one by one, and sometime thereafter the ground shifting in a uniform and pre-planned way to leave the lighthouse standing where it had always been, but depositing this underground part of it inland. I saw this in vast and intricate detail as we all stood there, and looking back, I mark it as the first irrational thought I had once we had reached our destination. This paragraph is extremely important because what she is saying, and this deals with the sort of theme of power and control, right, is that she's had a vision. And as we find out later, at the end of chapter 1, and even further on in chapters 2 and 3 and 4, she's actually being led to believe, envision these things, right? She doesn't actually see them rationally. Why? Because she's not the one that's come up with this vision. Someone else has given her this vision. Who? In this case, it's most likely the psychologist, although it could just be something that was triggered inside of her mind. But the fact that it was in such vast and intricate detail gives me the impression that she is being controlled at that moment. She is being controlled, which is why she can see things so clearly. Because when you have a vision of something, it usually comes in a sort of fuzzy sort of way. But if someone were to control it and make it clear and obvious to you, then it's no longer necessarily your ideas. Here we go. This is the first words that we hear from other than the biologist. This is impossible, said the surveyor, staring at the maps. Again, she could see the surface of things. You know what's supposed to be there. There is no indication of a tower or tunnel there. And she's like, so what on earth is this? And yet, there it is, I said, unless we are having a mass hallucination. So, you want to take note of this. Whenever the biologist uses the word or phrase, and yet, even just the word yet, and yet, that is an indication of the uncanny. Because again, you know that when you see a map, everything's supposed to be there. And when it's not there, well, you say it should be here, but it's not here. It's familiar, yet unfamiliar. Canny, yet uncanny. So it's that sort of mixture between the both. And again, they could be having a mass hallucination at this point because there's been 4 days of them being on an expedition. But it seems more than likely that this is no mass hallucination and that it was there all along but was not on the map. So now the question is, why wasn't it there? The anthropologist finally gets her own say. She says the the architectural model is hard to identify. In other words, she doesn't know how it's built or what it's meant to be inspired by. Oftentimes, when you look at architecture, you know that when you see a tall building, It tends to share things with other buildings, but the fact that this one does not says there's something really odd. And again, this shows up later on at the end of chapter 1. As we find out, this is not just any kind of ordinary tower or tunnel. In fact, it's not a tower or tunnel at all. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The materials are ambiguous, meaning she's unsure of what has made this tower or tunnel, indicating that it was made here, but not necessarily made by humans, right? Without going inside, we will not know what kind of thing it is. Is this something that's been here for centuries and decades, or is it something in between? Not sure, and I wouldn't want to guess at how old it is either. So then the question becomes, are they going to go in, and what do you think they will find? And I'm going to make another video that kind of talks about that in a second. So good luck. Keep reading.